but she was trying to write a book that was warning. The first line of the book is, "The American experiment is in danger of failing." And she thought that sounded pretty alarmist, but she was trying to sound an alarm, but she ran out of time. Press doesn't like to cover bipartisanship because they think conflict and impasse is a lot more interesting than cooperation and getting things done. Partisanship isn't the problem, it's uncompromising partisanship.
Welcome to the Purple Political Podcast, the podcast here to have a lot of very interesting conversations, maybe find some solutions, maybe a debate here and there. And today we got an excellent guest for today's episode as we plan to talk about bipartisanship and some of the intricacies behind that. So let me introduce my guy here, Allan, and let him introduce who he is and what he's about.
Hi. Riddell, my name is Allan Rivlin, and I'm the co-author, along with Cheryl Rivlin, and my mother, who passed away, Alice Rivlin, of Divided We Fall, Why Consensus Matters.
All right. Yeah, it's a very interesting book. Can you kind of explain what it's about, the general idea behind the book and why it was created?
Yeah, the book started out, I would say, during the Obama administration, when everyone was focused on the deficit. There were two deficit commissions, Simpson-Bowles and Domenici-Rivlin. Domenici-Rivlin is my mother, Alice Rivlin, and Pete Domenici is a Republican senator. Simpson-Bowles was appointed by Obama, and he put my mother on that. So she was the only person serving on both those commissions. They had a lot of experts testify. They both looked at the problem from all these different angles, and they arrived at about the same solution because of arithmetic. There really was a fairly simple set of answers to how we get rid of the deficit without putting too much pain on anybody, taxpayers or beneficiaries of government programs. They solved the problem, but the politicians couldn't solve the problem. None of that stuff actually passed into law. They were in the middle of these big fights with countdown clocks and shutdowns and threats of government default. So my mother concluded, our economy isn't broken, our politics is broken. We know how to solve our economic problems, but our political system can't do it. So from that vantage point, she started looking into the future and getting very worried. If our politicians can't solve our problems, the public is going to get upset and they are going to challenge our democracy. Well, this was all before Trump, but she continued it after Trump got elected. But she was trying to write a book that was warning. The first line of the book is, "The American experiment is in danger of failing." And she thought that sounded pretty alarmist, but she was trying to sound an alarm, but she ran out of time. She passed the book to us. My wife, Sherry, and I spent 3 years trying to get her vision out to the public while the world was getting worse. But her warnings were getting more on target. So we knew we had to get the book out. So that's pretty much the process, is we just kept going along her vision. And as we were writing it, the things that she was worried about were happening. And we started realizing we had a book. We didn't need to sound her alarm. Everybody could see the alarm, but she also has a whole lot of solutions and a whole lot of depth of analysis. So that's where we end up with is in 2022 with the book that we have, but we think it's a book that's very relevant to what's going on now.
Okay, there's a lot of things to kind of touch upon there. First, one of the first things you said is something regarding a deficit. You may have kind of already elaborated, but I don't know if I missed it. Can you elaborate what you meant by like deficit and what issue that your mother was trying to solve?
Well, the government for a long time has been taking in less money than it wants to spend. And there are structural reasons for that. The last time we had a surplus was when Bill Clinton was in office, and Newt Gingrich came in and threatened to shut down the government, threatened all the things that the current Republicans are talking about doing again to try to get spending under control. But it turns out people like their government much more than Republicans think. So that ended up failing. The Newt Gingrich had to back down, but they came together and they got rid of the the deficit through a combination of slowing the rate of spending in some areas and raising more revenue in some areas. And by bipartisan agreement, they got 4 balanced budgets in a row. Now, go forward next to when Obama's in control, and all the Republicans were talking about a balanced budget amendment. They were all saying they were against the deficit, but they couldn't agree with the Democrats on how to get there. The Republicans just wanted to cut spending, and the Democrats wanted a balance, cut spending, and raise more tax revenue. That's what they couldn't figure out. The fact of the matter is we're right back in the same place. Republicans are complaining about the deficit. Democrats say they want to do something about the deficit. We spent $5 trillion to fight COVID. It was called the moral equivalent of a war. But after World War II, which was the last time we had our finances this far out of whack, we raised taxes a lot and slowed spending and got the budget back to balance. We paid off World War II debt. I think we're going to need to do the same kind of thing and pay off the COVID debt, or we could find ourselves where things are so out of balance, we start seeing it in interest rates going up and inflation getting worse. Oh yeah, that's happening.
That's very fair, very fair. So basically, from what it sounds like, kind of the initial Kickstarter of her creating the book and her worries being kind of implemented regarding bipartisanship is the fact that regarding the deficit and the inability to kind of move forward with that. Is there any other factors that played into it, or was that the Kickstarter and then she moved on from that idea?
Well, everything's related to everything else. And I know this show spends a lot of time talking about how we've gotten so polarized and we've gotten so negative in our politics. And so she looks at those trends going all the way back to World War II. She actually goes all the way back to the founding of the nation. Our nation was founded in conflict between different factions, and it was a system built to try to keep any one faction from taking over. And we still have all those things in place. But the system was also built because half of the country wanted to maintain slavery and half of the country thought that was wrong. And so they built a system where states have a lot of rights, but the federal government also has rights. And the point of disagreement has always been, I mean, through all of our history, whether the federal government has the right to tell the states that they can't discriminate, they can't segregate, all of these things. That's been the main fulcrum for the entire partisanization of our politics. So the book traces that history, and then it goes into economic analysis, and then it goes into political science analysis. It's a pretty deep dive into the discussions of how do we get to where we are and how do we get out of it.
Yeah, definitely understand, and you're right. For the most part, this podcast is very much in tune with conversation, discussion, not trying to demonize or toxify the other side just because of an ideological identity. So I'm very much in tune with that. So I do want to kind of dive into bipartisanship a little bit more. For the most part, when it comes down to it, by Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, left and right, a lot of it kind of derives from the reactionary versus the revolutionary, and that's kind of how everything was built up from that. So this kind of like a thought experiment. Oh, before I even dive into that, well, this is how we'll do it. This is a lot of a thought experiment. So, in your opinion, can you kind of dive into the positives of bipartisanship, and afterwards, can you dive into the current negatives that you see that's harming our current American society?
Okay, I can do that, but it's going to end up being a positive and a positive in some sense, because
Okay.
I'm actually both Alice and Sherry and myself, we're realistic, but we see some reasons for optimism around the idea of bipartisanship. Let me get there. First, what we find is that bipartisanship really does happen much more than people think, less than we need. So the fact is the press doesn't like to cover bipartisanship because they think conflict and impasse is a lot more interesting than cooperation and getting things done. And so they'll spend all year long last year on, will Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema give in to the pressure from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and move that Build Back Better bill through? And that was stuck. And that's what the press wanted to talk about, while the president was following two tracks. He had a bipartisan track that got him the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act. There was progress on firearms legislation, that John Stewart burn pit bill for veterans' health, and funding Ukraine in their war against Russia. I'm leaving out a few big ones. There was a lot more progress going on in the bipartisan path than the Democrats' only path, which eventually the compromise was made between the moderates and the progressives, and they took a bill that was half that size and passed that. Altogether, that's a whole lot of progress for Joe Biden and the Democrats to run on. So what we find in the political science literature is, in fact, most bills that pass do pass with support from both parties, including the leadership on both, at least one chamber of the minority party. And so what just happened is what has been happening all along. It's just that so many problems are not getting solved. We've reached impasse on immigration, climate change. You can go down the list. There's all kinds of bills where we just haven't been able to get to that bipartisan place. And we just agree to fight it out in the next election. And then the next election doesn't change as much as we think it will. And we're still in that impasse place. So in that sense, there are positives of bipartisanship. The negatives are, we do have very polarized politics, and we do have people not talking with each other, but shouting at each other, and mostly just trying to pin blame on the other side. But if you look at all the COVID relief bills and the other bills I mentioned in Biden, we've been having a lot of bipartisan successes when it matters, when the country's really challenged by a crisis or just needs to get things done.
Okay, so from what it sounds like, you're saying for the system of bipartisanship is very beneficial. But you mentioned the fact that there are certain things that don't get passed, that don't get implemented because of this conflict between the two sides. Is that due to the fact that these laws or the ideologies on both sides are so different, or because these laws or bills being implemented are not kind of fine-tuned enough for it to be realistically passed? What do you think is the bigger problem or the bigger deterrent in the circumstance?
Yeah, in the book we say, and I always speak of the book as there's three of us authors. My mother had the vision for the whole thing, but my wife and I, Sherry and I, did so much research and writing that we can't tell what she started and what we finished. And so, but what we say is, all that, I forgot where I was going with that. I'm stuck.
Oh, no problem. I can repeat it. So when you referred to bills and laws not being passed, my question was, what do you think is the biggest deterrent? The ideological split between the two sides, or the fact that the bills themselves are not fine-tuned enough to get passed in the first place?
Now I know how I wanted to finish that little story, and what we say in the book is partisanship isn't the problem. It's uncompromising partisanship. And what started really with the Americans for Tax Fairness, Grover Norquist, at the beginning of the Clinton administration, actually while Bush was still president, they started saying not one penny in tax increases. And we have the same kind of thing of gun rights. The NRA says not a single bill can pass that limits the rights of gun owners. And we have some of that now on both sides. It really did start on the right, but these lines in the sand, not a penny more, not a penny less, whatever it is, where you are uncompromising. And then you have the left has picked up the same strategy on many different issues, and the idea that compromise is bad becomes a real impediment to solving problems, because the whole system is set up around compromising. And there are some things where it's hard to imagine compromise. But I mentioned the gun rights in the NRA. The other side, the gun limitation, the harm reduction, gun safety people, they've always taken the stance that we'll take any compromise. We just need to start making incremental progress. Can we do background checks? Can we do this and that? And so the reason sometimes we have impasse is because one side is just stuck in a place where they just cannot move forward. And I think that's really where these longstanding, if you try to do a comprehensive immigration bill where there's a path to citizenship but more border security, where there's tests in place and things to make sure that it's difficult to become a citizen, but if you work hard and follow the rules, you can become a citizen. Some people will say that's an amnesty bill and try to end the conversation right there. And it's that kind of uncompromising position taking that has become the center of our politics. I mean, we have the term rhinos means somebody who's on the Republicans who will talk to Democrats. We have people criticizing moderate Democrats as being sellouts to their party because the majority of the party is progressive. But they're not. The majority of America is not progressive. It never has been. The majority of America is not Trump supporters. It never has been. And no faction can take over. That's the way the system is set up.
Very true. However, I do think the current generation makes things interesting with the implementation of social media and technology and its effect on the younger audience as they grow up, making the divide between the two parties a lot more dynamic is what I'll say for that. But before I want to go into that, one thing that you said was very interesting. Let me just remember. Now I'm kind of blanking on what you just said. Oh, so when it comes down to it, you kind of iterated that there's this uncompromise between the two sides on certain things. Why do you think that uncompromise exists? Do you think it's a people thing, or like you said, is there something even deeper behind it?
Well, I think that you're starting in the right place to bring in the role of technology. What we've evolved to, I mean, we used to have two political parties, and they raised the money, they decided what the policies would be, they figured out what the message was, they used their ability to get that message out to try to get voters to the polls. That whole system broke down. We now have what are called network party structures. And now I'm quoting from one of the political scientists in our book, and I can't remember which one, but we'll just keep going with that. These network party structures where the fundraising can be done online, the message development and finding the message for the audience is either Fox News or MSNBC. That there are people determining the message that aren't part of the party. They're part of the network party structures, and those interest groups, like on both sides of abortion, on both sides of guns, they're very much a part of that. Their economics say the more extreme position you take, the more attention and money you'll get. And that has been a big part of pulling our politics farther and farther apart to more uncompromising positions. Now, can I pick up on what you were saying about young people?
Yeah, go for it.
Because young people are using those technologies in new ways. But something amazing happened in this last election. And I think it underscores everything we're trying to talk about in this book. Because it's true that we're polarized, but there is a supermajority of Americans that believe in racial justice. There is a supermajority of Americans that believe in democracy that's determined by sharing ideas, checking the facts, logic and reason, and then we have votes, and then we count the votes, and whoever wins is elected. It's a minority that think that we use propaganda and bullying and deny the election results and try to overturn a legitimate election. So that supermajority goes from progressives to moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, independents, and even includes some Republicans who just don't buy into the crazy. And that supermajority played itself out in this last election, and especially among the votes of the young. So while we see this, older, whiter, angrier tone on, there used to be something called Twitter. I don't even know if Twitter's still around anymore.
Hey, who knows if it'll survive in the next few weeks? I don't know. Who knows?
But on all those social media and through those other, that is an older, whiter thing. Something else happened in this last election. There's a supermajority that in favor of women's rights and the right for women to make their own health decisions. And that turned out in this election. And everybody's theory of what would happen in the election that might be good for Democrats did happen. They got out their vote in the cities and among people of color. They got suburban Republican women to ticket split, to cast one vote for a conservative governor and then cast a vote against a Republican running for Senate who seemed like they had been drinking the crazy juice. So in that sense, a whole lot of good things happen. And again, I keep being an optimistic guy. Our democracy is under a very serious threat, and we have to be vigilant and continue the struggle past this election, continuing into next year when the Republicans are coming back into the House. A lot of them, I don't have a problem with Republicans. I have a problem with Republicans that deny the election results in 2020. I have a problem with Republicans that want to undermine my democracy by saying that elections aren't fair. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are going to be in positions of power in this next Congress. So part of the job of those of us who want to see the supermajority win is to separate those people from the Republicans that can be reasoned with and engaged in bipartisan legislation.
Yeah, for the most part, it's very true that technology has played two very interesting aspects in the current generation of politics. One is it can be very decisive in terms, or it can be very toxic, is what I'll use, in terms of the separating the two sides into bigger and bigger radical extremes and create more and more radicals based on some abstract logic that inherently I think makes no sense a lot of times on both sides. And then there's other aspect where it's giving younger individuals more and more information, more and more resources to want to know more about politics, to want to know more about their politician, to get more engagement on understanding the politician they're voting for. But one thing I will point out in terms of what you were saying is it definitely seems like a lot of these situations, especially when they go to college, is we know in terms of college institutions and in terms of young people in general, they lean left, they lean liberal, they lean Democrat. So in that sense, with the if we're focusing on this aspect, if more and more people, more and more young people are getting influenced by social media and technology and becoming democratic and becoming Democrat, doesn't that negatively impact bipartisanship, as in future generations the side of the Democrats will be heavily or be the majority compared to Republicans? Wouldn't that be a bad thing for bipartisanship?
No. First of all, I hope what you're saying happens. I
Fair
do
enough.
feel strongly that Democrats need a better appeal to those people who are not going to college. And I think that one of the things that worries me is if the Democratic Party becomes the college educated party and everybody who doesn't have the opportunity to go to college finds agreement with the Republican Party. And to a large degree, that's happening, and that's not good. And it's not the way things used to be. So I think it's very important that Democrats find outreach to communities that are trying to find their way forward without college. But I do agree with you that I think the Trump version of republicanism did great harm to the Republican Party, but it was already in trouble. It was really searching for a reason to be, and Trump realized there was an opportunity to defeat the whole Republican establishment, but what he replaced it with was Trump, which was based on a lie, and that's very bad news for thinking people moving forward. I think that the Republican Party is going to have to rebuild itself, but bipartisanship can happen and must happen, whether one party is strongly in control or the parties are very closely divided. And it probably can happen better when one party is strongly in control than when they're closely divided, but it's possible in both circumstances. And so I don't see more Democrats as being a threat to bipartisanship, but more uncompromising Democrats would be.
Okay. So with that said, you can't really dictate whether or not a Democrat's going to be uncompromising once they have the power and influence over the Senate, the House, the Supreme Court, or the president, VP, whatever. So you can't really, when time comes whether or not they're going to be uncompromising. So at the end of the day, the idea of bipartisanship is kind of like, okay, just in case there are those people, you have some combative force on the other side with Republicans, or even vice versa, to make sure that there's at the very least some deterrence against one another. So with that said, if the Democrats keep getting voted in, and this is just hypotheticals, if the Democrats keep just getting voted in, and you find out like most of them are uncompromising, and then all the bills that the Democrats want are passed, and all the bills that the Republicans want are not passed, then wouldn't that be problematic?
It would not, because things are getting passed. And really, the whole story of Divided We Fall, Why Consensus Mattered, available in bookstores everywhere. The whole story is about what happens when nothing happens, when we get gridlock, stalemate, and bipartisanship is generally the solution to that problem. And getting away from uncompromising positions is the solution to that problem. That's why we say we want people who can compromise, not people who are against compromise. But there is a long history of bipartisanship during times when one party ruled. Now, the Democrats were ruling from the end of the Great Depression all the way until the Reagan Revolution. Democrats were largely under FDR and under Johnson. They had huge majorities in the Senate and House, and they passed tremendous amount of progressive legislation during that period. But it is not true to say that they passed progressive legislation because they had so many Democrats. That coalition in both under FDR and under Johnson included a whole bunch of white Southern segregationist Democrats, the so-called Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond. And so when FDR was in power, he made some compromises to that group and passed some things with mostly Democratic votes. And Social Security passed with overwhelming majorities of both Democrats and Republicans, but there were provisions in it that made it so that it did not cover most African Americans. The descendants of slaves were not covered under Social Security initially because it excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers. That was changed under Truman. But most of the agenda that FDR passed, he went around those Southern Democrats and worked with Republicans. And so most of the legislation at that time, because there was a disagreements within the Democratic Party, were bipartisan bills. For the GI Bill, the mean, all those things that we talk about as being the great, the New Deal programs. And then by the time Johnson comes in, and he's trying to pick up President Kennedy's agenda on civil rights, he faces a filibuster by Strom Thurmond and those same group of the Dixiecrats, and they go to the Republicans and they break the filibuster with Republican Senate votes and are able to pass the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, fair housing, and all of that. And Johnson, the day that the Civil Rights Act passed, said, I think we've lost the South for a generation. And he was talking about Democrats have lost the South for a generation. Well, that turned out to be right. I mean, all of those Dixiecrats either changed their party to Republican or they were replaced by somebody who was a conservative Southern Republican. And that is what gave Ronald Reagan enough votes to pass his legislation in the 80s. So even when you have a large majority, there are always going to be disagreements, Democrats versus Democrats. And so if Democrats had a large majority, it would still be easier, and we learned this just last year, it would still be easier to pass legislation with Republican votes than to try to do it with just Democratic votes, because Democrats don't all agree, and then you don't have those other votes to fill in the gaps. So, I mean, last year we learned with the stalled Build Back Better bill that eventually got passed, but all those successes in infrastructure and everything else that Biden was able to do working with McConnell, it's easier. I got this as a mathematical formula. It's easier to get 60 out of 100 senators than to get 50 out of 50 Democrats. And that pattern has played out. It played out at the start of the Clinton administration. It played out at the start of the Obama administration. All of them struggled with Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate to pass bills that were Democrat only. So sometimes having those majorities in all three chambers, it makes you reach further than you can get agreement within your own chamber, and you're not going to get any help from the other side, and then you get stalemate and you get stuck.
Okay. So I want to dive into this a little bit. So for me, this is my personal opinion about the idea. So for me, when it comes down to it, I think you could definitely say, and I would agree, that the progressive nature of America was very much needed to reach where we are right now in terms of civil rights, in terms of women's rights. There, you can go down the line, obviously. I do think in our current society, the aspect of freedom and rights that America has is reaching a very interesting point where it's becoming very abstract. That's my personal opinion. So that abstractness is kind of playing into very interesting opinions, like on the radical left, is what I'll say. So I'm not really worried about, like, sure, the majority in general from the Senate, or the majority in general from, or just having the Democrat majority in all three branches. I'm not worried about that in particular. But the hypothetical is more so the aspect of it being an overwhelming majority to the point where we know that the Democrat is completely dominating. So my question is, do you have a fear that because of how easy, like, this is a hypothetical, maybe 10 years down the line, are you worried about if there's such a majority that the Democrats can just pass bills that they will make a huge mistake that will ultimately negatively impact America for the foreseeable future?
I'll be honest with you. I would have that fear about the other side. I worry that if the Republicans were completely in charge, they might make a huge mistake. I don't have that same fear about the Democrats because they're reasonable people who believe in the truth and can be persuaded by facts and evidence. And I don't disagree with them generally on what they're trying to do. Now, yes, it is possible that the Democrats could get into a place where there's an agreement to spend so much money we're in trouble. And I do worry that people will say, well, if you can spend to fight COVID, then why can't you spend to fight poverty or something like that and get back into the same kind of $1 trillion bills to fight every ill. That's something that I would worry on the very progressives might want to do, but I don't think they'd be able to do it because our politics is not divided 50-50. Our
Right.
politics is divided a third, a third, a third. And that's been very durable for a long time. That there's a third that are very strongly conservative, a third that are very progressive, and about a third that are in the middle. And you always get a supermajority if you can grab the middle and include that with either one of the wings. But neither of the wings has ever been a majority. So that's why you have a circumstance where there are 50 Democratic senators, but there are two that just simply say, I didn't say I was a liberal Democrat. I said I was a Democrat and I'm a moderate. And the Republicans will say, we never got to do what we wanted to do. We wanted to end Obamacare, and John McCain wouldn't let us. And the Democrats will say, we wanted to give child tax credits, but Joe Manchin wouldn't let us. But that has been the story sort of all along. If you don't reach for the center, you don't have a majority, and you find you can't get much done.
Okay. So are you saying that Democrats would be aware enough to keep to the relative center rather than move more and more left?
Well, let's be very specific about this if we can. There
Okay.
is a subset of Democrats that are anti-corporate.
Right.
They really think that corporations are the cause of all of our problems, and the capitalist system is suspect. And
Right.
that is their strong belief, and that they didn't just come up with that. That is well-established radical economics that has real, that there's a lot of bones there. I'm not saying this is a frivolous point of view, but
Fair.
anti-corporate Democratic Party could never be the majority. That there are too many people who believe that that what we need public-private cooperation. We need to let the corporations thrive and move forward. We just need to regulate them better so they don't make us sick. They don't get all the money. There is a natural tendency of capitalism towards inequality. And it's gotten very bad. And I think we need public policies to work against that kind of inequality. That should be almost our top priority. That is our biggest economic problem right now, is too many people have too much, and there's too large a number of people who don't feel like they fit in. They can't get economic security. And some of them are in our urban centers, some of them are in rural areas, and some of them are in the broad sections of this country that are largely exurbs and suburbs of our big cities, where the factories have all gone and the agriculture got taken over by the housing development. And people are looking around saying, what kind of jobs are there besides Wendy's and Burger King? So that kind of addressing our economic problems is real. But if you say the way we're going to do it is we're going to hammer down the nails of the capitalists, I don't think you've got a majority. I think you need to find a way to do it where business succeeds and brings others up, rather than saying I'm anti-corporate and I'm not going to compromise if the medical insurance industry isn't told, get out of here. We can do that through government-only policy. That is the limitation of the far left. I don't think that an anti-corporate Democratic Party will ever be anywhere near a majority.
Interesting. So I think the fact that you brought that up is very interesting, because one of the first things that came to mind when thinking about this hypothetical future is their effect on capitalism, is their effect on big businesses. Because there's a insinuation that there are people on the left that really hate big corporations, and for the most part, in terms of what you were referring to, I agree in terms of the issues behind the 1% getting richer, the middle class declining, more and more poor people are being poor. There's a problem there that needs to be solved. I agree. But my follow-up question is, what do you have more assurance for? A system put in place where the potential of a overwhelming majority Democratic side could potentially lead into that anti-corporate philosophy later on in the future, or system focused on making sure that, okay, you still have the other side relative, not obviously ultimately equal, but relatively equal, to the point where they'll make sure, unless it's like fine tuned, that you won't be doing something crazy in terms of a corporate bill affecting capitalism in a very negative way. So what do you think what do you have more assurance for in terms of the long term future? The the first thing or the second thing I said?
Yeah, I'll go with the second thing. And the way I would say it is that the voters will, the more Democrats need to reach beyond Brooklyn and Hollywood, the more they need to reach beyond San Francisco and Seattle, and these sort of hotbeds of progressivism, and get to voters in Iowa and Michigan and Missouri, to try to win states, Texas, the more they're going to have to be what Democrats already are. I say we because I was a Democratic political consultant for a long time. Then I wrote a book on bipartisanship, and I have to be careful. But that's really the point. Our book was written by three Democrats who, my mother was sort of the moderate establishment wing, but she was moving more to the left at the time of her death because of the inequality problem being so bad and so durable. I'm to the left of my mother, and Sherry is to the left of me, but all of us came together and to try to present one idea, which is the more we can listen to each other, cooperate, try to say, okay, I can agree with part of what you're saying. Let's build on that. The more we can get done. And so it's in that sense that what Democrats already are is a coalition between very strong progressives in those areas where only a very strong progressive could win. But there also are an awful lot of Abigail Spanbergers, and there are an awful lot of representatives that need to appeal to suburban voters in order to win, and they are who they truly are. Abigail Spanberger worked for the FBI. She's a real moderate. She wants to not defund the police. She wants to fund the police.
Right.
Those positions exist in the Democratic Party already. So I think the way forward is not for the progressives to stop advocating for what they're fighting for, because they are the beating heart of the Democratic Party. But they need to understand you can't do that in Ohio and win a race in Ohio. You need to be a different kind of Democrat that's always been there. One of the things I like to say is Democrats think that no Democrat can win in North Dakota or South Dakota or Montana or Iowa, or you look at those states. Democrats there's 5 states, which means there's 10 senators in those plain states. I think I'm leaving out Nebraska. So it's Nebraska, Iowa, North and South Dakota, and Montana. Democrats used to have 8 out of those 10 seats when Jimmy Carter was president. Even when Bill Clinton was president, they had 7 out of those 10 seats. It's only been recently that we can't win there because Democrats used to represent the West and the prairies and those parts. We used to have a lot of Democrats from the unionized states like Ohio and Michigan. And in the last election, Ohio's been turning red for a long time. Michigan is solidly blue until it went for Trump one time. We need to have Democrats that represent those people. So we need to be a progressive / moderate party, a center left party, in order to ever be the majority. So that's why I don't worry about things going too far in one direction. We need to reach in the other direction to get more stuff done.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I agree. Because the general idea for like all Americans or people in general is for constant improvement, the constant change for the most part. Everything could always be better, but there should always be a point where you understand that if you do things either too quickly or too extreme, you can destroy the whole system you're building in the first place, right? So when it comes down to it, let's talk about the system itself then. Bipartisanship, how it's utilized in America right now. What is like some of the things that you think can be improved? What are some of the solutions that we can implement to kind of fix the big inefficiencies of bipartisanship currently?
Well, I want to take that from a long-term agenda to an immediate agenda,
Okay.
because I think there's some things that can be passed not in the next Congress, but in a lame duck session between now and the next Congress. And I'm gonna take. I love the fact that this show we can take some time out for a couple of stories, and if not, but we need to talk about the story of Barack Obama right after the Tea Party got elected and what he called his shellacking. And suddenly they were a very strong rightward turn in our elected officials. Everyone on the Democratic side was depressed and dismayed and despondent. Barack Obama, according to the reports we read from that night, he had an inspiration that this was an opportunity for him. So he made a deal with Mitch McConnell. So this was Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Mitch McConnell, and John Boehner, and the other Democratic leaders. And what they did was they extended the Bush tax cuts, which was what the Republicans wanted. And Obama figured that he couldn't stop them. They were going to extend those Bush tax cuts. And if they expired, it would have been a hit to the economy that was very fragile at that point. Coming out of the 2008-2009 financial meltdown. And so in exchange for letting those tax cuts stay in place, he got unemployment benefits. He got a reduction of the payroll tax. He got $1,000 per child tax credit. He got a college tuition tax credit, extension of the earned income tax credit. They ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell to allow gays to serve in the military. And there was an arms control negotiation that was starting then called New START. All of those things happened in November and December before Christmas, right after, quote, losing an election. And McConnell was ready to deal because he wanted a lot of those things not to be issues of contention in the next Congress, because the new guys coming in looked a little crazy to him and he was worried what would happen. So they got that huge deal. I think there's just as long a list. That was called the most productive lame duck session in history. I think there's a possibility 2022 could beat 2010 in terms of some of the things that they're talking about and actually making progress on. So defend democracy with the Electoral Count Act, which is the very law that was unclear and made it possible for Trump to have his coup. You have to clarify that the states can't replace the slate of voters to the Electoral College, and that the vice president's role is ceremonial. He's just there to count the votes. So that bill has gotten out of the House. Mitch McConnell says he's willing to talk about passing it, which is the same as sending up a balloon to see if he can get away with it, and I think he will. And I think that Democrats should say, fine, let's pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act at the same time. Republicans, like I said, they supported the Voting Rights Act when it first passed. There were more Democratic votes against it than Republican votes against it. They voted unanimously to support the Voting Rights Act a few years ago when it came up. Then the Supreme Court invalidated it. Try to get that passed in this session. That may be more of a reach. They're talking about the Respect for Marriage Act, which is allowing people to marry anybody they want to in any state. They're going to have to pass a budget bill. In doing so, that will include a lot of Ukraine funding that some Republicans are talking about it being controversial. You won't find Mitch McConnell thinking funding Ukraine support is controversial. And there's a National Defense Authorization Act that would do a lot of things. That's something that's really on the Republican agenda, but that's room for compromise there. Whether or not they can raise the debt ceiling so we don't have another threat of the shutdown, or do something about Dreamers, or something about abortion, those may be harder to achieve. They may be possible. But I think there's a possibility that right away there are things that we can agree on. Abortion's really tricky. I need to let you talk. I talk too much, but abortion's really tricky because Republicans are now locked into a position where they're on the wrong side of the majority, and that came out in the last vote. So it's going to take them time to figure out how they can get out of the box they're in. But the box they're in is hurting a lot of women who now have to travel to another state or have other rights taken away from them. So they need to figure this out quickly, because I don't think Republicans really want to fight on the ground they're fighting on right now when they find out that most Americans don't agree.
Yeah, to touch upon that a little bit. Yeah, for the most part, I don't see why this goes hand into hand to something I mentioned earlier, is that they're so stuck in their ideology, and even the logic they say, it's all of it to life. They stay steadfast on that point so much they don't give leeway to the exceptions that need to be talked about and the circumstances that go beyond that sometimes. So for the most part, yeah, the I don't know what when it comes to the act or bill you're referring to. What is it? Does it? I didn't look into it. Does it plan to re-implement Roe v. Wade or do something different?
There's a couple of different things that are being considered. The one act that is probably the easiest because it does the least, but it's called the Women's Health Protection Act. It's something
Okay.
that Representative Judy Chu from California put in, and it died in 2021. But the idea of it wasn't to reverse the Dobbs decision about Roe v. Wade, but it was to reverse the things that Texas was doing, trying to make abortion illegal by having people, I guess, deputized to turn in the citizens of their own states, charge them with a civil offense
Yeah.
for performing or aiding an abortion. So that bill just tried to make that kind of practice illegal because it's ridiculous. Efforts to try to codify Roe v. Wade on a national level would be the much higher bar to reach, but the public would support that. I mean, where most people are in the public is they don't believe in that abortion should be available to everyone on demand, and they don't believe that there should be no exception, no abortions, no exceptions. That those two
Yeah.
positions are the two extremes, and almost everyone in America is somewhere between those two. And
Yeah.
the rest of the details they don't want to think about. They don't want to think through all of the exceptions. But the one thing they know is, in this last election, we fought Republicans who used to be for no abortions, no exceptions. That was because they were part of these network parties, and that was the position of the anti-abortion, anti-choice groups. Well, they all ran that way to win in the primaries, and then found out that wasn't a very good place to be. So they started emphasizing,
Yeah.
"Oh, I'm for exceptions. I don't. You don't have to worry about me. I believe in exceptions." Well, that's not really where most of the public is. You can't have an abortion except if you're raped or it's incest or your life is in danger. They believe that the right answer is much more in the middle than that. Basically, that you should have an abortion if you need one. They may not go all the way extreme and say that the public should pay for it, because some people in the public see that as a moral wrong. But somewhere between available for everyone and free and available and no abortions, no exceptions is where most of America is. And the Republicans have to get from no abortion, no exceptions to no abortion, some exceptions. And then they're going to realize that position isn't defensible either. And we have a long way to go on this issue, but it's frustrating when a party is stuck in their ideology and can't realize that they need to change their position if they want to maintain the support of women across America.
Yeah, it's a very the discussion behind this topic is something I plan to have a discussion because it's a very nuanced. There's so much layers behind it, but the bare minimum, the realization is that these exceptions do exist and they all need support. regardless. There should never be a situation where you say no to these people. And if you want to go beyond the beyond that, that conversation could be had. But even entertain the no exceptions is ridiculous. That's out like absurd. And like we spoke about, that's kind of like one of those, oh, this is my ideology, this is my religion, this is what I've been told, so I'm going to stick to it regardless of the logistics behind what I'm actually saying, right? So going back to the prior things you were mentioning in terms of the give or take is basically how it sounded like. You know, you mentioned the Obama example, and then you mentioned the current situation and the hope that there might be some give or take. So, are you saying that the solution it should always be some excessive give or take? You know, I'll give you some wiggle room, Republican or Democrat, and then we can get all these bills passed. Is that the primary solution, or is there more to it?
It's the right instinct. Details matter, and there's some things
Right.
that you can't compromise on. I mean, we don't allow states to pass discriminatory laws anymore.
Right. Yeah.
It took us a long way to get there, and that was a hard. You can discriminate, you just can't put it into law. I mean, I'm not saying discrimination is over, but discriminatory laws are over. And I mean, one of the you just talked about the abortion, and that's one where people are really dug in, and it's part of my religion. And then you look at gay relationships and the way people have changed. That kind of conversation could have happened 20 years ago, where somebody said that's an abomination, that's against my religion. That has society has evolved on that question as a lot of things changed. I mean, we found out, we knew people who were gay. We knew, I mean, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you start realizing that that it's something you can live with. And so that's why the Respect for Marriage Act is moving through. There are no Republicans who are going to stand up right now and say, they're not none. I don't say there's zero.
Right.
There are very few in Republican circles that are going to stand up and say, I continue to think that marriage is a man and a woman, and that's God's will, and we need a law against people who love each other getting married. You know, even in Alabama, even in Texas, you can't pass that law now. So to get it off the agenda of where the two parties disagree, I think the Republicans are going to be very happy to allow a Respect for Marriage Act to pass in a lame duck session.
Okay. All right. So with that said, I think that makes a lot of sense. But in terms of the long term solution for this system, even beyond that, do you think there's anything systematically or even socially or culturally that could be done to make sure that the system is more effective? I think something to, and you can kind of touch upon this if you want to, something that should be thought about is the need, because this is kind of what this podcast is about, is a need to kind of discuss the finer details beyond the ideology. So, is there something that can be put in place to kind of get at that eventually, or is there just in general a way for us to make sure that we're passing laws a little bit more effectively in the future?
Well, our chapter 11, not bankruptcy, but chapter 11 of our book has probably about 24 specific things people can do if they want to support more dialogue, more discussion, less ideological impasse, more bipartisanship, more civil discourse in our society. And the list is not any silver bullets. It's a bunch of small things that we know we can do. And it's joining all the organizations that are based around strengthening our democracy and good government. And a lot of them are bipartisan. We only listed the ones that were bipartisan, but that's your Common Cause and your Bipartisan Policy Center, and the National Center for Civil Discourse, and there's hundreds of them. The Brennan Center for Justice, and the Fair Vote from Stacey Abrams. So one, join others to agree with you and work on some aspect of the problem, because the far right and the far left, they work hard for that microphone. They're organizing, they're raising money, they are passionate about their views, and you can't stop them. They have a constitutional right to express their opinion, just like everyone else, the right to petition your government and all of that. But the people a lot of people say, but they're so noisy, they're so loud, they dominate the discussion, and there's nowhere for someone like me to turn. And I'm here to tell you, there's organizations to turn to try to work with others, to work as hard as they do to make that microphone as loud for people who want to defend our democracy and reason in the truth. The other thing I'll say is this election was, to a large degree, decided generationally. And if you look at voting by age, the older people were much more Republican, the younger people were much more Democratic, and people split their tickets and they found those election deniers and they voted against them. Well, yeah. I will place a bet on who's going to win between the older people and the younger people in the long term. And that's the younger people, because the old people are going to die off. And so that makes me very optimistic that these new technologies we were talking about that make it possible to be intolerant are being used by young people to promote tolerance and dialogue and discussion. And yes, we've seen how bad Facebook can get, and how bad Twitter, if it still exists, I don't even know, how bad it can get. But it's not a one-way street. You don't extrapolate that completely into the future. Somehow, the idea of democracy, not Democrats, but democracy and coming together as a nation, has won 3 elections in a row. The 2018 midterm, the 2020 election, you can deny it, but it's the fact. Joe Biden won, and he won promising to be a uniter and to work with the other side. And then this past election,
well, saying MAGA, kind of toxifying MAGA Republicans probably wasn't the most ideal, but in general, I think he is doing that.
I have a trick for him. Somehow he got himself to ultra MAGA whatever, and all you have to do, you don't have to identify the people who are against democracy. They identify themselves. If you believe in democracy, then you count the votes and you find out who won, and Joe Biden won. If you want to undermine democracy, you say, I don't know who won, or seems like there's a lot of questions, or Donald Trump won. All of those things really undermine our democracy. And so people who vote against identified themselves by saying that the 2020 election was rigged or stolen or whatever. And Americans did pretty good job of finding most of them and voting against them. We got to convince Carrie Lake that she really lost in Arizona, but she did. And Mastriano and all of the people who were really ultra MAGA, if you will, but we know them just because they denied the last election. They did very poorly, and they ran way behind other Republicans. In state after state, you find there was a lot of ticket splitting. People voted for a relatively sane person for governor, but they voted against an insane Republican for Senate, or vice versa. So that's my view of the long-term future. Is this too shall pass, not by itself, by people educating themselves, by people listening. Oh, that's the other long-term answer, is developing the skills to listen to the other side more, broadening our media diets, listening to things even if they make us mad, so we understand what's making other people mad, and joining bipartisan groups in your own community If you go to the National Center for Civil Discourse, which is one of the groups we talk about in this book, they have these models of citizens coming back. The trick is if you show up on one Tuesday and meet a bunch of people who you don't agree with, and you all talk about what you don't agree about, nothing changes.
Yeah.
But if you come back every Tuesday and start to have conversations with people where you learn that, they like soccer, you like soccer. They, that they like pizza, you like pizza. Their kids go to a school at the same school as your kids. When you start seeing people as people who have opinions rather than just seeing them as their opinions, we can all move towards a greater understanding and finding the supermajority that believes in our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it plenty on this podcast. That when it comes down to it, the need for discussion, the need for conversation. Honestly, I've also said this on my own that there are some people who look to understand, but I don't even think your main goal should try to understand the other side, because sometimes ideologically, religiously, situationally, based on how you grow up, sometimes you won't understand, you won't completely buy into what the other person's saying, but at the very least finding some level ground, some compromise is a huge step forward. I mean, you hear it all the time. America's one of the big things America was built on is compromise in the first place. So compromise comes a long way. Understanding the other side and developing discussion. I do want to say that I definitely agree with the whole. Hey, we lost. They stole it. Hey, everything sucks. Like, I will never ever buy into victim mentality, and that's literally the same thing. Republicans can't go like, oh yeah, these groups do this, and then act like a victim when they run for election. Like, you're being inconsistent. I'm not with that. You gotta move on and try to grow whatever stance that you're trying to lead into. So, with that said, one of the final things that I want to bring up that I'm curious on your stance about is, what would you say of with a you don't even have to take it to the federal level. We'll take it at a very local city level maybe. What do you say a system that puts in place an even amount of representatives on each side? Um like that, it will always be even. The only question is who will be the representatives for each side. So in that situation, and it's just something that I thought of. I'm just curious on your thoughts. So in that system, it will be, for example, like 10-10, Democrat, Republican. There has to be 10 on each side. Who gets voted in is completely based on the people, of course. But there will always be an equal amount of representative thoughts on each side from both sides. What do you think about a system like that? And your general thoughts.
I got a couple of general thoughts. First of all, the idea is a good one, but I think you're going to have a lot of problems with it because of one of the big themes and one of the big drivers of our problem is what's called ideological sorting, and
Right.
that is geographical sorting. That people have sorted themselves into communities where you couldn't find 10 Republicans or you couldn't find 10 Democrats. I'm not talking about 10 people to represent the Democrats in that area. I mean 10 Democrats at all in some communities in what we
Very
call the red
fair.
states. And in our inner cities, it's hard to find 10 Republicans. We just did an event here in Washington, D.C. With the former mayor of Washington, who was also somebody who worked with my mother closely, Anthony Williams. And she worked in city government, or she worked for the city in an oversight role when they had an economic collapse. And she was on the control board that first was hated, but it ended up being what the city needed to get its finances under control so that it was able to stay afloat. And DC is very unusual, but in some sense, it's like a lot of cities. But every single member of the city council, perhaps save one, is a Democrat. And we also have what's called the DC Statehood Party and the Green Party. So it's the battles that erupt are between progressives and liberals. And the progressives and liberals can get to a point where they're at impasse and they can't pass any legislation. And that's okay. That's the democratic process working itself out. As long as you don't get to shutdown, which is where the federal government has gotten. So you, whatever the group is, whether it's Democrats and Republicans or all Democrats or all Republicans, there's still going to be tensions. If the problems were easy to solve, they would have been solved. If there's a majority to do something, you usually do it. The things that don't get done are the things that are dividing people. And so that's where you have the problem. So I'm not sure that forcing the numbers to be equal would really be a step forward. What we need is more. We need to fix the gerrymandering problem, so people really believe their vote really matters in an election, rather than it's all been determined by how you draw the districts. We need to do. There's a whole bunch of experiments in voting that are talked about in the book, like ranked choice voting and top two and these kinds of different systems for voting that some states are experimenting with. In general, move things in the right direction. But what's more important even than getting more moderates elected or more partisan split, changing that one way or another, is the feeling of voters that their vote really matters, that they're really participating in this democracy. Because you go all the way back to the founding fathers, the design was there. That's the magic, is our democracy really does allow people to cast votes that do matter, that do change the way we govern. We govern ourselves through our votes. And so any kind of change that makes people feel more like there's somebody in that chamber who represents me and what I want to do. And they don't have to agree with the other side. They have to, what you were talking about earlier, that finding common ground, even if we don't agree on everything, can we find something we agree on and pass that? That's the mentality that I think moves us forward.
Yeah, in general, I agree. And I will say that the logistics behind the idea will be tough to kind of implement because of what you said in terms of the areas and whatnot. But to dive into the bill thing a little bit more, I don't know, like, I can't say I know everything about, how bills are passed, but for those situations where there's that stalemate, where there's no leeway being given, I don't know, what would you say to a system where the... Okay, tell me if how much say does the populace have to a bill that's been evenly kind of passed by both sides? Do they have any say to make sure that it gets passed, or is there any type of system where they could instill their will as a majority population of America to make sure this bill gets passed, other than voting for the representative?
That's a really good question, Riddell, because the answer is complicated. And it's complicated by the system that was set up by our founding fathers. They rejected the idea of direct democracy, where, people vote on referendums or, they vote on the policies themselves, for indirect democracy, where you vote for a congressperson who's then supposed to represent your views. I would say that based on all the analysis that we have in the book of the political science, the public has too much rather than too little voice in the conversations where compromise is necessary. And what the American Political Science Association had a task force on negotiating and compromising. And that was essentially their conclusion, that the discussions have to happen behind closed doors. And away from the camera. When the cameras get involved, people lay down these absolute positions, and the press is trying to say, well, would you negotiate on this? Would you compromise on that? And that's a negotiation in public, and that negotiation needs to be in private, and then you can handle it out. And here's the most direct example. The only way to get the deficit under control is less spending and more taxing. And both those positions are unpopular. You have to, if you raise taxes and you're a Democrat, the Republicans are going to say, tax and spend, tax and spend. If you try to lower spending, the Democrats are going to say, they want to end Medicare as we know it. They want to take away your Social Security. The exaggerations come out. There are solutions where you can raise taxes without raising tax rates. You just get rid of the deduction for that second home. You get rid of the carried interest. You close all the loopholes. We spend so much money in our tax code on giving tax breaks to rich people. And if you close those oil and gas leases and you put together, you add up the numbers, you can come up with a system that raises a lot more revenue, mostly by increasing taxes on the wealthy who can afford it. And you don't have to raise tax rates, certainly not raise tax rates on the middle class. And at the same time, there are ways to reduce future spending by getting healthcare costs out of that have been growing faster than the economy to grow at the rate of the economy, or just slightly faster than the rate of the economy. There are ways to get Social Security can be solved relatively easily by a couple of relatively small fixes. Right now, rich people get to a certain threshold and they stop paying into Social Security. They ought to get rid of that cap and let people pay Social Security on the whole thing. Small adjustments to the cost of living adjustment, things that people will not really feel in their day-to-day life. And the deficit is now on a downward path towards getting to a balanced budget, and we're doing the right thing. You can negotiate that behind closed doors and say, if we pass this, both sides are compromising. This is what Reagan and Tip O'Neill did when they extended the life of Social Security. If we pass this, we get the deficit under control. That'll help with inflation. Our fiscal and monetary policy will both be pushing in the same direction. But you can only do that if you all jump together, because each of the elements in that is unpopular all by itself. And one side will blame the other and it'll never pass. So if the public's in that room when that's being negotiated, it's not going to happen. But if you can negotiate the deal and say, let's do these changes, the Democrats and Republicans agree to them, the public would reward that, because you'd be solving a huge problem, the deficit and inflation, at the cost of some relatively minor changes that aren't what people's big fears are.
Okay. So my follow-up to that is there's twofold here. Is the first thing is I would for my hypothetical, I wouldn't say enter them into the negotiations, because I agree they should never be a part of the negotiation itself. But in terms of an impasse, giving them the option to choose from one side or another as an individual, why would that be problematic? Not okay, they can say whatever they want, especially the vocal minority. They're annoying, sure. But for the most part, how it turns out is that there will be a specific side at the end of the day. There will be a majority at the end of the day that has a specific side that they want to advocate for. So if that's the case, negotiations are done, two sides, everybody vote, and there's that's all said and done. So what do you think about something like that?
I mean,
only for, just to clarify, only for situations where there's a huge impasse that won't move or budge on either side.
I think there's something to that. There was a there was a movement to try to take impasses like the budget situation to citizen juries, and let them work through all the details that would be available to a congressperson. Let them hear the briefings that a congressperson would hear. And my mother was involved in some of these as the expert budget briefer, because that's what she was expert in. And they were able to solve the problem just like the commissions that she served on. And in that sense, I think that then the public is really coming in with with information and facts. The fact of the matter is there's a myth that if you just cut all the waste in the spending, you could balance the budget and solve the deficit. And that's just not true. When people look at what it is, they say, well, you can cut the budget, just don't cut Social Security or Medicare, don't cut national defense, don't cut, well, you got to pay interest on the debt. When you borrow the debt, you got to pay it back. Don't cut education, don't cut the national parks, don't cut, the EPA. Pretty soon you've listed the entire budget, and it's all things people want to keep. If there were things to cut, if there was a budget item for waste, we would have cut it. It's that myth is propelled. I mean, I would say that's a perfect example of one side not willing to compromise. The Republicans' position that you can't raise taxes one penny means that we're just constantly in conflict and constantly in debt. And we need more revenues because the public really does support government of this size. It does create more opportunities. There isn't anything we want to cut that's like, I'll cut your thing. No, I mean, sorry, foreign money we give to foreign governments is a tiny, tiny, less than 1% of everything we spend. I mean, when you go through and look at the things people might say you would cut, there's not that much to cut. You have to look at the future, and you have to look at the big programs, and you have to bend them slower to make cuts that meaningfully reduce spending. And that really comes down to getting our healthcare costs under control, because the nation's getting older, and our healthcare is more expensive than any other country in the world. So that's the only way to do it. Well, if you do all of those things on the cut side, you realize you've got to get more revenue. You got to get rid of those Trump tax cuts. They didn't create the economy we have is the economy with those tax cuts. I don't know that they're so wonderful right now in terms of what they're contributing, but to the degree they're contributing anything, they're contributing stimulus, and the economy's overstimulated. We have a very low unemployment rate, and we have rising interest rates and rising inflation, and that's economy that's overstimulated. So tax cuts are inflationary, tax increases are anti-inflationary. So if you want to control inflation, make the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes. It means that housing for everyone becomes more affordable because the wealthy bid out the middle class, which bids out the lower middle class, which bids out the poor. Too much money out there in the hands of the wealthy causes inflation.
Okay. Yeah, I do think there's something to that, and I can definitely see the argument there. I think especially something needs to be said considering this age of technology, the ease in which a citizen can participate in politics, even just voting, nowadays is, obviously way better than back in the day. It's way more inefficient to get the public involved to vote on like every little thing. Now, if you really wanted to, you can have the public vote consistently because everybody has a phone, everybody has a laptop for the most part, generally. So it's very interesting. At the very least, trying it at a local level to see its efficiency, I think would be interesting. But another aspect you talked about is like the negotiation behind doors and the discussions. So you mentioned a lot about the 1%, the rich people. Isn't another concern that people would have is the fact that these negotiations behind door is more so benefiting these rich people, considering the aspect of lobbying and getting undercut deals between politicians and these rich corporations, getting those breaks that you were referring to? Isn't that one of the aspects that people would be concerned about behind these negotiations behind closed doors?
Absolutely, and they should be, because if you look at all of these threats that we faced, including the budget crisis that we had that I started talking about, and then the financial crisis and the way we responded to it, that made inequality worse. We had policies to protect the banks and protect the housing industry and mostly protect the mortgage lenders and all of that. We bailed out the auto industry. but who was bailing out the people buying the autos, the people living in those homes, the people working in those businesses that was closing down? COVID came and the same thing happened. And what we say in the afterword to the book, because it happened after my mother's death, and that's where Sherry and I were allowed to speak. But we had agreement to run big deficits to fight COVID, and it was bipartisan. But the form that it took was the two parties saying, I'll borrow money to help my people out. I'll let you borrow money to help your people out if you let me borrow money to help my people out. So we suddenly had money for everything. And the businesses got bailed out, and the financial sector soared because of the easy money policy. And the inequality is just getting worse. And when we pass big policy responses to big crises, it makes that problem worse. What you get is inflation, which hurts the people at the bottom much more than it hurts the people at the top. And so we do have a system that is completely out of balance. And here I completely stand with the progressives in saying, you've got to pay attention to that. This system is getting to the point where it's unstable. And it's like the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, the period right before the turn of when 1900, just before 1900, right around there, was a period of great inequality. The business sector completely owned Congress. I mean, people just said it out. Which senators do you own? And the system was completely serving of the wealthy. What happened was the economy collapsed in a series of depressions. There was a pandemic, but we had then the progressive and populist eras, and eventually, you get to Teddy Roosevelt, who was a progressive, and FDR, and we had a new system where the working man was sort of in charge. You got to fight for those rights, and people are doing it. But you're absolutely right. You need to elect Congress people that reflect you and your values, and will not be bought by the wealthy. And all of us have a vote in one congressman, except for me, because I live in the District of Columbia, and we don't even have a congressperson.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I think we went over a lot of very interesting information. I think the overarching idea is that people should be willing to have the discussion, the conversations, being more involved in politics, especially this younger generation. Vote, your representative in, vote. The more people vote, especially for your particular side, if we got more progressives, more liberals, more Democrats voting, then that's good for them to get their bills passed. And Republicans just got to keep up at the end of the day, if we're being completely honest. So maybe it's something to think about on the other side as well. Any final thoughts that before we wrap up?
Well, first of all, this has been a terrific discussion, and these have been great questions, and I really appreciate it. I think the final thought is listen more and talk less. It's like the Alexander Hamilton, the musical, was running through this whole show, the whole book as we were writing it, and that talk less and smile more. It is where this comes down. It is about dialogue and listening and participating and understanding that if you feel strongly about politics where you live, people probably agree with you. Try to understand people who live in a different area and why they see things differently. It really comes down to getting outside the big cities if you're a Democrat. Understanding the big cities if you're a Republican. We've separated ourselves. We need to find a way to come back together, and the technology's there to help us. We're having this conversation. People are able to listen to it and participate. The technology made this problem worse, but the technology's not going away. We have to figure out how to use the technology to find our own connections.
Yeah, very true. Exactly. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Appreciate you coming on, Alan. I think I agree. This was a really good conversation, very enlightening and very insightful, of course. All the information will be in the description. All this information will be on my website, of course, as well. Can you say the name of the book again for the
The
people?
book is the book is Divided We Fall: Why Consensus Matters by Allan Rivlin, and Sherry Rivlin. And
Yes.
it's available everywhere. And we have a website called Zen Politics, Zen like in Zen Buddhism, zenpolitics.com. And there's also a website called dividedwefall.org, which isn't actually our book, but our book is included among a lot of others that are writing on these topics about our divided government and how we move forward and unite our country to protect our democracy.
Yeah, of course, for sure. All that information, make sure you check it out. A lot of enlightening information. The book is very interesting as well. Hope you guys enjoyed. Rate it 5 stars, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Leave a review. I read the reviews. Hope you guys enjoyed. Y'all have a good one. Take care and peace.